Good evening. I first and foremost want to thank all of you for joining us for this, the second keynote presentation of the 16th Annual Central and Southwest Asian Studies Conference. We are truly privileged to have all of you with us. As you have probably seen, most of you, this has already been a wonderfully successful conference. So a round of applause for all the organizers, please. I want to especially recognize a few people here who have really worked hard to make this happen. I know we have done this almost on every occasion, but I think it's very important for us to remind ourselves the dedication and commitment that it takes for this kind of event to come together. First and foremost, the co-director of the Central Southwest Asian Studies Program, Dr. Ardi Kia. Ardi, please stand up and be recognized. We have a very special friend, colleague, brother with us who has been single-handedly responsible for starting the Arabic language and culture program at the University of Montana. And it's to the sadness of my heart and my colleagues' heart that this will be his last semester at the University of Montana. But we hope that someday soon, the university will understand the value of such amazing instructors and professors and will recall him and ask him, beg him, plead with him to rejuvenate what he already started. Professor Samir Bitar. The other colleague who gave a fabulous presentation and has been instrumental in educating us, but also bringing a new dimension to our discussions, Professor Michel Valentin. Michel, please stand up. But we are here also to recognize a very special person, a person that I have watched for many years now, dedicating his life. When this university did not have money, he would teach courses for free. And in order to really maintain the integrity of the program that he was responsible for, and that is the Chinese language and culture program, we have a brother, colleague, and a very dear friend in Professor Zhen Zhao. Zhao, please come here. You're not done. We have a very small gift for you, a recognition trophy for all you have done for us and your students. As you know, this has been a work of collaboration. Central Southwest Asian Studies Center feels blessed that we have received so much help and support from so many different organizations and individuals. And one of those organizations is, of course, the Montana World Affairs Council. And in the last several years, this collaboration has grown by leaps and bounds. And this year, in particular, our two dear friends, Bob Seidenschwartz and Janet Rose, were amazing to work with and very much instrumental in making this conference happen. So I want to ask the Executive Director of the Montana World Affairs Council, Janet Rose, to say a few words of welcome to you. Janet, please.
Thank you. I'm not going to talk long because, I mean, we're here to talk about Syria, and that's part of what the Montana World Affairs Council really strives to do, and we're so honored to have been invited to co-sponsor this. You know, the beauty of Montana is that we are often so insulated from all the challenges and the difficulties of what's going on in the world around us. But at the same time, we need to bring that world into ours and us out into that world. And there's hardly a place other than the Missoula and Bozeman and Helena and Great Falls that do it, you know, the way this kind of an organization can. And working with Mirdad is always an incredible, incredible honor. I just want to, Mirdad asked me to tell you just a little bit about the Montana World Affairs Council, and I'd like to say I think that we're going to evolve just a little bit. You know, for those of you who know me, you know I'm very involved in wildlife and conservation and international affairs and Africa and Asia. And so and there's so many global issues that are so significant to our lives and to the world around us. Global health, human trafficking, refugee crises, water issues, land issues. And so while we've always had a wonderful Distinguished Speakers program and our global education initiatives working with K through 12 is large and growing, we also hope to bring a lot more of these kinds of global issues to our community and to the schools. We just finished an academic world quest with our program director. There she is, Nikki Lane. And we had over 200 high school students from one corner of the state to the other. And these kids were introduced not only to the university setting, they met ambassadors, they met the new mayor of Helena, they talked with kids in Congo, not kids, they talked with students in Congo live and in real time. They learned about the Eastern Congo Initiative. And so many of them came away from those experiences and said it changed their lives. And so that really is what we are trying to do, and working with people like Dr. Kia and the university, and many of you, you know, I'm really excited about what we can bring to our communities, not just our community. And so, Dr. Kia, thank you so much.
Thank you. And in that context, building on what Janet has said, I want to personally express my gratitude to Nikki Lane for all the amazing work she has done. Nikki, please stand up and be recognized too. We unfortunately have to say goodbye to a wonderful group of scholars from China. They're leaving tomorrow morning at 6 o'clock, which means getting up at 3:30 these days, or 4 o'clock. But we really appreciate them traveling thousands of miles to be with us on this occasion. And I want to ask them one more time to stand up so they can be recognized. So now we come to Syria, and a wonderful speaker. He is a friend and colleague in the true sense of the word. And as I have watched him this morning on the radio, we were there for an hour and a half, he is fabulous. And then I watched him in the classroom. I was even more impressed by the depth of knowledge that he brings and the passion that he brings to teaching. He is Dr. Amer Al-Azam, originally from Syria, having spent many years in Lebanon and throughout the Middle East, from one of the most prominent families, which goes back all the way to Ottoman times. Those of you who have had my classes, you know what we are talking about. And the Azam family is one of the most recognized and one of the most distinguished families in the Levant. And it is because of that, but it's because of the scholarship, the analysis, the passion that he brings to the field, that he's so well recognized in the Middle Eastern studies. He's a professor of anthropology and history at Shawnee State University. He dedicated his life to the preservation of cultural heritage, archaeological and historical sites in his ancient country, Syria. He fought for them, and when he couldn't, he had to leave the country. And of course, he will talk about that a little bit, but he continued the fight outside of Syria, and he continues to do that. And what is amazing about him is that he's a man who has never given up. despite all the pain, despite all the suffering, despite the horror that has been visited on that beautiful country, he still keeps on fighting. So it is with a great honor that I introduce to you Dr. Amer Al-Azam.
You know, Kia, Professor Kia, Mehrdad Kia, this is my second visit to Montana, and I fell in love with your city and your state when I first came here the first time 2 years ago for the, is it on? Oh, okay. Sorry, yeah. For your, what was then would have been the 15th conference, or the 14th actually, because it was 2 years ago. And now I've been invited again to come and be with you. And when Mehrdad sort of emailed me and asked, I was, you know, you have to sort of maintain a certain decorum, and said, of course I will accept. But inside I'm like, yes, I'm going to be back here. Don't tell him I said that. And in the couple of days I've had to spend with Kia, Mehrdad Kia, you know, it's been quite refreshing. And I have to say that I've never met a person who knew more people and seemed to be liked by more people. Like everywhere we went, everybody seemed to know him. They shook his hands. They welcomed. I've got to change my aftershave or something. I don't know. I don't get the same. Anyway, so thank you for your invitation, Mehrdad. I really appreciate it. And thank you for coming to listen to me to talk about a subject that is both dear and painful to me, and that is my original home country, Syria. Syria has been very challenging, not just for Syrians, but it seems also over the years as this conflict has developed and grown and gotten worse and deteriorated for initially the neighboring countries, and then further afield into Europe and the United States and now the rest of the world. It seems that, you know, the conflict in Syria touches everywhere. And every few weeks, we're back in the news with some horrific headline, whether it's another massacre, another catastrophe, another disaster, another chemical weapons attack, and so on and so forth. So what I'm hoping to do in my brief sort of meeting with you here tonight is to try and maybe just enlighten you a little about what's happening there, but also give you a sense of perhaps some of the less common issues, things that you may not be so aware of, you may not hear about in the news, or get a more nuanced, if you will, idea of some of the critical aspects of this conflict, and also try to enlighten you, if I may, on some of the challenges that our current administration, that's the Trump administration, faces when dealing with a situation like that we have in Syria. So I'm going to start by asking ourselves the question, because I noticed that yesterday and elsewhere we often hear the word Syrian civil war. So my question is, should we call it a civil war? Because that is something that Syrians don't seem to be able to agree on. And in fact, most Syrians I know, at least that, or I speak to, would prefer not to call it a civil war, and perhaps I would share this with you. A civil war is essentially a conflict between groups within a state. So different parties within a state, they start a conflict between each other, they start a war between each other for whatever the reason that may be, and usually as a byproduct of this war, the state collapses, or it is essentially marginalized. It no longer plays a role. The state and its institutions are essentially either left outside the conflict, they're moved away, or it collapses on itself. In Syria, unlike your classic or typical description of a civil war, the state itself essentially declared war on its people. the state represented by the regime and its ruling elite. And that, for me, makes it much harder to recognize it as a civil war in the context that we normally think of civil wars. The second part of why this civil war label is difficult to attach here is that often civil wars, as I started off, between two groups of the same state. You look at the people fighting in Syria today. I promise you that on both sides, on all sides, there are many more foreign non-Syrians actually fighting there on the ground. On the regime side, on the Syrian regime side, you have thousands of Iranians, Afghan Hazaras, Lebanese Hezbollah, mercenaries from Russia, from, I think the company's called Wagner. There are troops, forces from many different countries, all supposedly helping the Syrian regime. Similarly, from the opposition, if we think of ISIS, not even the opposition, but we go to ISIS, think of the thousands of foreign fighters they had from Europe, from the other Arab states. Tunis, which is supposed to be one of the few kind of bastion stable countries, still secular, has the highest number of foreign fighters in Syria, 6,000 at their peak in 2014, 2015. 6,000 Tunisians. I know that there were Uzbeki fighters on the side now. Right now there's an Uzbeki unit fighting on the side of one of the Islamist brigades up in the north. Even from China, Uyghurs. So this is an international call. How can we still call it a civil war? If there are all these foreign nationalities all currently fighting on the ground in Syria. So perhaps we should, can I finish my lecture before you ask your question, if you don't mind? So the next point is, in terms of the conflict itself, how did it start? By way of a reminder or refresher, some of you might already be very familiar with it, others maybe not so much. It starts as peaceful protests in March, as part of a wave of protests that are sweeping the Arab world and the Middle East in general. It starts in Tunis. They topple their dictator, Ben Ali, in December 2010. In early 2011, it spreads to Egypt, and Mubarak, within literally less than 2 weeks, is gone. It then spreads to Yemen, Bahrain. Protests are erupting in Jordan. In Libya, again, I remember it was late February when the Libyan protests started. And Gaddafi was probably the first real hard sort of authoritarian dictator who would have no qualms about shedding blood. And he'd decide, no, I'm not going to give in on this one. And he starts to basically shoot people. The army goes into the streets and starts to kill people. The international community decides to make a stand. They warn Gaddafi, we're going to destroy your army if you continue, and they do, and then we have the Libya sort of scenario. And then, about a month later, mid-March, March 15th, the protests begin in Syria. And again, the Assad regime decides to use force. The response of the regime and the amount of violent, deadly force used by the regime essentially escalates very quickly. And every day and every week, the numbers of dead and arrested rises. So that by the end of the summer of 2011, as we go into 2012, it shifts from a civil unrest type movement, civil society, local protests, to a fully fledged military confrontation between an armed opposition and the armed forces of the regime. Essentially, we're at war now. And we have been at war with this regime since 2012. The regime's narrative on this, it's a binary. It's a binary approach. Either me or these radical terrorist Islamists. And it would try repeatedly to find some sort of label. And so in 2011, they would accuse them of being Muslim Brotherhood. When they couldn't find any Muslim Brotherhood amongst them, they decided to accuse them of being foreign agents. I remember in 2011, TV, anchors and TV sort of talking heads from the government side would get on TV and accuse the Qatari government and BBC of staging mock protests in their studios and filming them to pretend they're in Syria. There was one spokesperson who I actually knew personally, who went on television and in an interview with the BBC, when asked about the flow of refugees because of the increasing violence, heading towards Turkey and Lebanon, she said, no, they're not refugees. They're holiday makers. They're off on holiday. I'm not joking. You can find her. I can give you her name. You can find her interviews. So for them, and eventually it develops into, when they run out of options, it becomes, okay, they're radical Islamist terrorists. And to make the point, they release a whole group of radical Islamists that the regime had kept in its jails and brought in and out of jail to use at various times. Because this is a modus operandi. This is a standard way. If you think of the regime's playbook, it is to use proxy forces to destabilize neighboring countries. They did it in Lebanon in the 80s and 90s. They did it in Iraq when we were there. And it is well documented how terrorist groups were being trained in Syria from 2003-4 onwards. Then they were being sent to Iraq to fight there. I have personal experience with this because I was teaching at the university, and we would have these large sort of halls where you had students and they would be packed. And then after a while, I noticed that there were gaps in the areas, and some of them I knew by face. I didn't know them by name. So eventually I asked some people, I said, wasn't there a group of students from such and such an area that used to sit in that area here? They're gone. They said, oh, don't you know, sir? And I said, no, where are they? Oh, they've been recruited to go fight jihad against the Americans in Iraq. This is 2004, 2005. Under the auspices of the Syrian government. In Zabadani, which is a suburb sort of in a mountainous, it's like outside Damascus to the west side. It's a summer resort area, but also well known for having training camps for various organizations, including the PLO and Hezbollah. And there was one particular camp known as the terrorist training camp. It was supposed to be a secret camp. Nobody was supposed to know about it, except that if you got into the public transportation, which we call microbuses, small minibuses, and you would say to him, drop me at the terrorist camp, he knew exactly where to drop you. Because the guys being trained in the terrorist camps, when they got their day off, they needed to come into town, so it became a regular stop on the highway. From the opposition side, our narrative, no, it's a revolution. This is not an either or. This is not Assad regime or extremist radical terrorists. We're talking here 2011, 2012, 2013. There was no ISIS, there was no Al-Qaeda yet. And of course, you then have the regional actors, Iran, Hezbollah, Turkey, the Gulf states, and then finally the Russians and the United States all get involved. And it becomes, we say in Arabic, salata, meaning salad. It makes chopped salad. The first real problem for us, and if you will, an expanding dimension to this conflict, that the conflict was not going to be contained, that this conflict was going to spill outside the borders of Syria, and it was going to begin to damage neighboring countries, was in 2013 when finally, out in public, in the open, Hezbollah forces start to fight alongside the regime in the middle of the country around the city of Homs, in an area called Qusayr. And they begin to, in a way, turn the tide for the regime for a while. And then, obviously, other regional actors counter that by providing more support, more weapons, and so on and so forth. And then the next major input, if you will, from an international power comes in the form of the Russians, who start a bombing campaign under the umbrella and auspices of joining the war against ISIS. Now, this is really important. I want you to sort of watch this. So you look at, sorry, take this. So you look at the map up here, okay? All this territory here, okay, this is the ISIS territory, okay? All this sort of beigey territory. This is in 2015, 2016. All these red dots, these pinky dots, this is, and the red, this is, the red and pink are all the Russian airstrikes. So between September 30th, 2015 and January 25th, 2016, and then February 2016, they're all concentrated in this area here, 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 and here, with a few hits here. So even though Russia was supposed to have gone to war against ISIS, they're not really strong. These are all the coalition airstrikes. This is us. All this is us. United States, Great Britain, France, so on and so forth. But the Russians are busy hitting the opposition, who are also fighting ISIS, by the way. And then again, if you look at end of 2016, almost exclusively, all the airstrikes, the Russian ones, are over here and here, and just a few over there. So the Russian campaign is maintained primarily against opposition areas and not against ISIS. So what are the outcomes of this? Which brings me to my third point for tonight. Well, in terms of outcomes to this conflict, one of the biggest problems that then, and is a manifestation, if you will, of this spilling out, this spilling over the border, is the refugee crisis. We start to see beginnings of this refugee crisis. I mean, let's put it this way. The refugees start to flow out as early as 2011, 2012. But it doesn't become a flood and it doesn't become a major problem until 2013 and really reaches a peak 2014, 2015. And it reaches a peak because of the intensity of the airstrikes. Most of these airstrikes are not happening on the front lines. The people escaping are not running away from here or here, because there are very few airstrikes. They're running away from here, where most of the airstrikes are. And these airstrikes are not often against the front lines. I mean, there's no front, look at it, this is the front line. Why are you hitting this area? Why are you hitting here? There's no front line there. These are civilian towns. Of course, these civilians are the mothers, the sons, the daughters, the fathers, the children of the fighters obviously fighting. So the purpose of striking these places is specifically to terrorize, damage the families of those fighting on the front lines. But the net result is that you get a refugee crisis that reaches this peak and spreads into Europe with devastating effects. As a result of this refugee crisis, the very glue that held the European Union together almost came undone. Brexit, that's when Great Britain left, decided to vote to leave, is in part a byproduct of the fear of the open borders and the refugee crisis that came with it. The rise of the right, the extreme right, the National Front in France, and the victory of the right-wing extreme parties in Hungary with Orban, and in Austria. These are all products, direct or indirect, because of this refugee crisis. I'm just going to say one more thing about the refugee crisis. I want you to imagine the following. Imagine a population of 23 million people. That is the total population of Syria around about 2011. Of that 23 million, by the end of 2015, 2016, over 50% of that population had become either internally or externally displaced. That is over 50%. To put this into perspective for you, according to the United Nations figures, the single greatest humanitarian catastrophe since World War II occurred in 1947-48 with the breakup of India and Pakistan, when 12 million people had to move. But that is 12 million out of a population of over 400 million. You can do the math. 3% maybe. In Syria, the displaced are 12 million out of 23 million. That is why Ban Ki-moon then, who is head of the the UN, basically said, this is the world's single greatest humanitarian catastrophe since the Second World War. He wasn't exaggerating. And of course, many of these people push into Europe and in their wake bring a wave of instability that we are still cleaning up, that the Europeans are still trying to sort of adjust to. And then finally, ISIS, Daesh. Daesh is the Arabic acronym that we prefer to use. Of course, the story of ISIS is a whole story in its own right, and I'm not going to go into any details, just because of time, and as I said, it's a story of on its own. But very briefly, Daesh starts off from the remnants, ISIS starts off from the remnants, the Al-Qaeda remnants, that survived the surge of General Petraeus in Iraq. They're pushed to these small little sort of pockets in the marginal areas in the borders between Syria and Iraq. When Syria starts to destabilize, they quickly move into Syria because that gives them more space. And also through the open borders with Turkey, because of the collapse of the state and the border controls, they're now able to open up to the rest of the world through Turkey. In 2013, I was in this, I went, summer 2013, July 2013, I went down to the city of Raqqa. It had only about a month and a half before then been basically taken away from the regime. And we could see the beginnings of what was to come. And some of us actually really went and tried to speak to people and say, hey, look, if you don't get some sort of control over this city, you're leaving a void there, and it's going to get filled by one of the Al-Qaeda type groups. And sure enough, within a few weeks, ISIS show up and they take over. And then a year later, just 1 year later, al-Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS, captures Mosul, and from the pulpit of the Mosque of the Leaning Minaret, launches his caliphate. And all the while, here in the United States, we're watching. We're not doing anything. Because the Obama administration's policy at that time, rightly or wrongly, was not to get involved. In fact, we don't start to get involved until the final offensive against the city of Erbil in the north, the Kurdish city of Erbil. The ISIS actually get to within, literally, 7 kilometers, that's around 4.5 miles, of the city, a city with thousands of foreigners, Westerners, including Americans. And then we panicked and started a bombing. We didn't move when ISIS moved against the Yazidis. We didn't move. When ISIS took Mosul, we didn't move. When ISIS took Raqqa, we didn't move. We let them. And then when it reached catastrophic, a point of catastrophic no return, we moved. And then it was too late. And by then ISIS had reached its peak with thousands of fighters and recruits and from many parts of the world, as this chart shows you. And also a great capacity for making money, primarily through sale of oil, sale of any sort of mineral wealth, looting cultural heritage, and more importantly, taxes. They levied taxes because they operated as a state. They declared themselves as the state, and they levied taxes. And destroying something like that is much harder and takes a lot more effort than just going after a few bad guys. So, bringing us closer to the present, I just want to do a quick review now of where we are with the various elements, the main actors, if you will, on the ground, Syrian actors, if you will. And then I'll look at the non-Syrian actors, and then I'll take us to the current administration's choices or options, if you will. The regime today, if I were to give you an update, is now in what we call territorial consolidation phase. They're now consolidating. They have essentially taken most of what they can take with relative ease. Future campaigns against new areas, I'm going to sort of grab this because I want to point to the map. So moving against these last remaining major bastions of the opposition, with the exception of this area here, means you're going to have to clash with other external powers. In this area here, we control this area. This is US. Here, it's under Turkish sort of control. Down here, it's the Israelis and the Americans. Over here, it's the Americans again. So for the regime to move with its allies, the Iranians and the Russians, against those areas, it risks a direct confrontation with the United States. So this is why I said they are now in territorial consolidation, holding on to what they have, mopping up areas where there is a general agreement that this is not going to be an area of interest for any of the major powers. And so what we see now on the map is a hardening of these lines as well. I don't know if you see these these little sort of fortresses. These are Turkish army positions that have inserted themselves all along here to try and separate the opposition forces from the regime forces. The reason why there's nothing here is because this area is held by Nusra, which is an Al-Qaeda affiliate. So the Turks position themselves behind it over here. And then this is all Turkish controlled as well. And again, in this area, the Israelis have made it very clear that they will not allow Iranians or Hezbollah to come anywhere near their borders. And the only way the regime can take those areas, because it doesn't have its own manpower anymore, it used those up in 2013, 14, 15. So it needs to rely on those foreign mercenaries, and the Israelis won't let them come down here. This is the line, that's it. I don't know what we will do here, but for now we're not sort of giving it up. So, and when, I think it was end of last year, there was an attempt by the Iranian militias or Iranian proxy forces to push into this area, we kind of toasted them. And similarly here, if you remember, when the Russians tried to cross the river earlier this year, we also killed quite a few of those as well. So we've been quite robust, we as in the United States, have been quite robust in defending our territories against any potential incursions. The opposition, again, their situation is very, very much reduced compared to how they were in 2016 or 2015, when they had reached their maximum point of extension, if you will, in terms of control. In 2015-2016, the combined control of the opposition, including forces like ISIS, exceeded 70% of the country, with the regime only holding 30%. I believe now the figures are around 55% of the regime, 30, well, actually, or maybe even 60% of the regime, 70%, 30% to the Kurds up here, sorry. Oops. So this is about 30% of the country. This is about 55% of the country. And then this is about maybe 15, 20% of the country. And even then, the opposition still remains fractured, still remains, there's a lot of infighting amongst them, which has severely weakened their ability to respond to any major offensives should they be committed. The only way the opposition could survive is because it is being protected by whatever major power is also in charge. And these are the, what we call the Asatana Agreement. This is the redistribution of the opposition areas, with areas to be given to the regime, areas that are going to be sort of like a buffer zone, and then areas to remain under opposition control, but also under Turkish supervision, if you will. The only one that we should pay attention to, really, because it's interesting here, is the southern front, because of the Israeli presence. Of all the fronts, there's been a lot of movement and change of territory between the different sides from 2015, 2016, 17, and 18. And most of the shift has been from opposition to regime, except in the southern front, where it has been pretty stable. There was some losses up here. This is an older map, but there were really some losses up here and a few over here. But that's it. The reason? Because the Israelis maintain it. They maintain a red line. You cross it, you get burnt. And that's why it's been fairly stable. And finally, the third component are the Kurds, who you may have heard of. There are allies in the Eastern Territories over here. This is all now controlled by the Kurds, even though their core areas, the main Kurdish population centers, are right up here. But they have managed to spread right across to here and all the way down here. And this has had a very significant impact, because in their core areas up here, they are the majority population. But when they move all the way down here, they're no longer the majority, they're now a minority population. So even though these territories are normally under Kurdish control, the majority of the population there is not Kurdish, it is Arab. And that, for me, has great potential, either for amazing things to happen, if we invest in those areas correctly, if we find a way to encourage these people to work together, build the sort of institutions that are necessary to ensure that some form of civil order and some form of democratic process can occur there, then there is hope and a future. But the other side of the coin is that the Arabs and the Kurds will not get along, and sooner rather than later, a new civil war or a new insurgency, if you will break out here between the Arabs and the Kurds. And we'd be caught in the middle of that. It hasn't happened yet. We have, I think, the capacity to make it go either way. The jury's out. And finally, I just wanted to point out, this is the Afrin area. You may have heard of this as well. This is another Kurdish area in the far west of the country over here. Turkey launched an offensive against Afrin in February and essentially drove the Kurds out of it. The primary purpose was to expand their area of control over northern Syria. So you can see now the Turkish control zone runs all along the border and all along into this opposition area here. So why is all of this important? Because it now tells us not just who's in charge, but what future prospects for Syria might look like. The main protagonists on the ground, the Syrian protagonists, if you will, are the regime in one side, the opposition on the other, and the Kurds. So these are the three Syrian components. But today, none of those Syrians have any choice or real power to make any decisions about their own future or actions on the ground or in terms of what they would like their future to look like. Each group is under the direct control and are essentially beholden to one of the other great powers. So the Russians and the Iranians, they essentially determine what the regime does. So if the regime wants to go to the left and they say, no, you're going right, it goes right, because it cannot do it on its own. Similarly, the Turks now control almost all the opposition areas in the north. So really, the opposition has to do what the Turks tell them to do. And the United States, we control that large territory over here. So this is the US territory. This is the Turkish-controlled area. And this is the regime areas which are essentially under Russian and Iranian control. And down here is that area which is under also US and Israeli control over here. And this dynamic is essentially now what shapes events on the battlefield. And when negotiations occur between parties, that's the dynamic that rules. And it rules because it is based not on the interests of Syrians living in these areas, whether they're Kurdish, whether they're regime, or whether they're opposition. It is based on the interests of the key actors, the regional powers, and both their domestic and international needs. I've summed it up in a way with this, so that you get an idea of how these national interests and, if you will, domestic interests of each of these major powers essentially play off. Turkey, under Erdogan, he seeks to improve his popularity and legitimacy amongst his people, amongst his population, amongst the Turks. He's just called for an election. Just now he's called for a snap election this summer. So he needs to look good. And the way he does that is by attacking what the Turkish state has labeled as enemies of the state. And for Turkey, it's the Kurds. So as long as he keeps beating up on the Kurds, he's going to win the popularity stakes. And so he's going to get elected again. Similarly with Putin, Russia. His popularity is based on him being able to project a powerful, strong, resurgent Russia that is respected and feared around the world, that now has shaken off the shame of the failure and collapse of the old Soviet Union. To understand Putin, you have to understand the trauma that he and his type went through when the Soviet Union collapsed, and they went from being able to dictate and demand anything they wanted in their countries to becoming minor actors, and he had to claw his way back up. And he gets his legitimacy from being able to project power around different parts of the world. He recently had an election, so it was important for him. And so the strategic interests of Russia are also tied both with Assad and that keeping Western influence, European, Western, American influence out of Syria. As long as he's able to do that, he looks good. And then finally we come to our fellow here, our man Trump, in the United States, again, he seeks popularity amongst his own base. He's constantly in election mode. And again, the strategic interests of ISIS, as we declare them, are defeating ISIS, containing Iran, but also there is the internal Trump election narrative that he has to maintain so that he keeps his popularity with his base. So for Trump, he has a dilemma. America first, and if that's the route he's going to take, it means he's going to have to withdraw from Syria and the world, versus America great, which means we also have to counter the Russians when they project power, and we have to also be assertive back. We have to contain Iran and destroy ISIS. So which one is it going to be? Are we going to be America first, or are we going to be America great? And it seems that at least this administration can't make up its mind. 1 minute it's got the America great hat on, 1 minute it's got the America first hat on, and they keep kind of getting in each other's way, and they're trying to figure it out. Finally, I want to talk something about, just close off with the chemical weapons attack. And kind of, in a way, it'll give us some sense of not just the horror that is happening in Syria today, but also perhaps how the international community is dealing or addressing with this issue, and including the United States. As you all know, Duma, April 7th, 2018, there was a reported chemical weapons attack, 70 dead, over 500 affected, and these figures are according to WHO, the World Health Organization. I didn't make these up. And you should also know that this particular attack is not the first, not the second, not the third, not the fourth, not the 10th. It's well over 200 attacks. Some of these attacks use chlorine gas, others use mixtures of chlorine and other nasty chemicals and substances like sarin. All very deadly, all very unpleasant. If you think chlorine is just something you wash the toilet with, you all know the gas used in the First World War that really brought about the conventions. That was chlorine gas. It burns your lungs out. When you inhale chlorine, you cough your lungs out. That's what happens. You literally, when you cough, bits of your lungs come out. That's the effect of chlorine. I don't know which is more merciful, chlorine or sarin. At least sarin, you die. I mean, this one, you just keep coughing until you have no lungs left. Khan Sheikhoun, 1 year ago, last April, 83 dead, 300 affected. And then the big one, when in 2013, Assad regime hit several areas around Damascus, 1,400 killed, over 3,600 affected, which brought about the big, you cross the red line, was the Obama administration going to strike? Then in the end, they came up with this fantasy sham story about how they were going to essentially, the Russians were going to persuade the Assad regime to hand over all these chemical weapons, and then we played around with the words, these are the declared weapons. Of course, that means we don't know about the undeclared ones, and this was all part of the Iran deal that we were supposed to be also cooking, and we didn't want to upset that, so we were willing to let that ride. I'm not going to go into those details. But the net result is that this is the area around Damascus. These were the opposition areas, and that was Duma. That's where the strike happened. What can we say in closing about the latest airstrikes? Were they effective? Were they worth the money? We spent millions of dollars firing over 100 Tomahawk missiles. I'm a taxpayer like the rest of you. I think it was a complete waste of money. Not because we fired them against Assad. I think he deserves to have missiles fired at him, especially when, not just because he's breaking international norms, but because of all the other crimes that he has committed. But it was, as they said, a very limited strike. This strike served one purpose only. It allowed Trump and Macron being the French president, to stand up and claim that they had acted when their red lines had been crossed. And this action was not designed to weaken Assad or his regime or affect his overall behavior or even his military capabilities, nor stop him from committing atrocities. That much is clear. Why? Because there was no substance to the message. And these are the 3 sites, 2 sites up in Homs and 1 over here. For me, had we chosen, you can fire, you can hit those sites, that's fine, and they're not important. They serve no importance. You know, the fact that they hit this center for research, this center for research had been defunct for a very long time. More importantly, putting together chlorine gas bombs and mixed with sarin is something you can mix in any basement. You can mix it in your own basements. You don't need a lab. You don't need, you know, professors in white coats to do it. It's a very low-tech thing. So what really needed to happen, in my opinion, in order to send a clear message to Assad that this type of behavior is not acceptable, was to target what I would call a high-value symbolic target. A high-value symbolic target is a target not designed to essentially damage Assad's military capabilities. That is not the purpose, because we don't want to do that. I'm trying to stay within what is our national strategic interests. And we have decided, rightly or wrongly, these are our strategic interests. We don't want to damage the Assad regime. But we want to deter the Assad regime from using chemical weapons. If that is our purpose, and I'm going to follow that just for the sake of argument, then at the very least go after a value target like one of the palace on top of the hill. This is a large palace complex. It was built on land confiscated from my family, but that's another matter. It's true, it's true. And it sits right above Damascus looking down. And every Damascene looks at that palace and knows the power it projects, the authority it projects. And you can send him a message and ask him to leave. Say, look, we're going to strike it after 1 day. I don't care. Because when you hit that, the shockwaves that it will send amongst the ranks of the regime, its supporters, will shake the regime to its core. That's the kind of message you want to be sending. And then I promise you, they will not use chemical weapons again. Because you've drawn a red line and you've... So what we've done, okay, what we've signaled to the Assad and his enablers is that the world doesn't really care that much. And so in return for Assad firing chemical weapons at a heavily congested area with opposition and fighters and civilians packed in together, and then cleared it. Because the very next day, the rebels surrendered. The very next day. He hit it on Monday, they surrendered on Tuesday. He hit it on Tuesday, they surrendered on Wednesday. I can't remember the day. It was April 7th. I can't remember what the day was. But they surrendered right, literally, within 24 hours, they'd surrendered. So as far as Assad was concerned, it was a bargain. I get one derelict research center and a couple of storage buildings blown up by 100 cruise missiles, and in the meantime, in return, I managed to sort of finish off a rebel enclave and didn't have to lose any men fighting or material. That's a scoop. And I guarantee you that Assad, probably with Russian sort of pressure, will not use chemical weapons for a while until the next time he needs them, when they attack the next enclave. And that will probably be up in the middle, around the middle of the country, that last remaining area, without having to tangle with the Turks or the Israelis or the Americans. Thank you.
Questions?
So we have 2 microphones. Please raise your hand, and either Janet or I will come to you, but with one precondition. That is, please ask questions and make your questions concise and precise. And Janet, please, go ahead.
Real quick, what does John Bolton in the mix mean for U.S. foreign policy in Syria?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I know of John Bolton. We know his track record, but as yet, it is unclear. I think, and this is just I'm just guessing here. I really don't have any information. I think John Bolton's instincts would be to stay in Syria, to fight Iran, to literally, essentially start a proxy war against Iran in Syria. That would be probably what John Bolton would love to do. But his boss has made it very clear that he wants nothing to do with Syria and would like to get out yesterday before today. Because, remember, I told you, is it America first or America great? And he keeps sort of flipping between the two. So until he settles on something, and right now I see the meter, if you will, tipping more towards the America first. And therefore I suspect that he's probably going to get out, and I don't think John Bolton will get his wish. He might get it elsewhere in other ways, but I don't think he's going to get it in Syria.
Early on, you referred to a lot of the initial fightings as mercenaries in the spring offensive. Who would you say was funding a lot of those mercenaries?
Well, we know that the Iranians have been paying the salaries of the Hazara, for example, as early as 2013, 2014. These are Shiite Afghans, many of whom had become refugees or had moved to Iran, essentially escaping from their own country. And we know that the Iranian government was recruiting heavily amongst them and then sending them over to Syria, and many of them with little or no training. It was like I know in 2015 it was like a mincing machine. They would come in, they would get mowed down by their hundreds. Many of them got captured as prisoners, and it was really, really sad. And when those who were interrogated, they would say, we were offered, a small, like $500 to come here, and a promise that our families would be allowed to stay in Iran and not forced to go back to Afghanistan. That's one example. Yes? Iran funds the foot soldiers. Iran funds the troops on the ground. Russia essentially, and also props up the regime by giving it, cash. But Russia, on the other hand, provides the air cover. All this air cover and the strategic sort of tactical high above command and control. All this is done now by the Russians. The regime has very little real sort of control over it has very few real troops anyway left. Those were decimated early on in the war.
Thank you. Okay, so you talked about if they played their cards right in the Kurdish-controlled area, that it could become fairly stable and probably prosper. So you think there could be maybe a bid to have a Kurdish state in the future?
I think Kurdish state is very unlikely because of the other regional actors. I mean, that will guarantee a major full-scale regional war amongst the Turks, the Iranians. It will bring everybody down on you. I wouldn't play with that fire. And I should also sort of maybe qualify my statement a little in that it was really wishful thinking on my part. I mean, ideally, one of the biggest problems we've had in Syria as an opposition is since 2011, we've been forced to look down a very binary sort of situation where it's either the regime or some sort of extremist radical formation, whether it's Al-Qaeda, whether it's Nusra, whether it's Daesh, etc. And both poles, both extremes are essentially two sides of the same coin. And at various times, both sides did everything they could to destroy any potential for any sort of moderate viable alternative. So the reason why, and you are quite right to ask yourselves, well, what's the alternative? The reason why there is no viable alternative till now in Syria, despite 8 years of conflict, is because the regime did its utmost to destroy any, kill, torture, maim, imprison, anyone who could possibly present an alternative. And similarly, on the opposition side, the extremists on that side also went after the moderates and eradicated them. So my hope, and really it is hope, that somehow we would be able to create an environment in this Kurdish area. Because if this is going to become another minority-dominated enclave, then what's the difference between them and the regime? The regime is essentially a minority-dominated state. And then we're going to create another minority-dominated state, and the same grievances are just going to keep building up and eventually blowing up like they have. And they will blow up again and again and again. And each time they blow up, it's going to be worse. And unfortunately, I'm telling you, I don't think my wish will happen. I think the worst case scenario is going to happen. And the worst case scenario is going to be as such. The United States is going to withdraw from eastern Syria. Remember that. We will withdraw. Trump will keep at it until he gets out. Because that's the America First component. And that's going to win out. And when he does, he's going to leave the Kurds behind. And when they do get left behind, the regime is going to move in, ally itself with the Arabs, who are extremely disgruntled because the Kurds have yet to have managed to sort of work with them. And they're going to push them back towards their areas. And the Turks on the other side of the border are going to be waiting. And essentially, the Kurds are going to get caught between the hammer blows of the regime and its tribal allies and the anvil of the Turks. And it's going to be a slaughter. It's going to be horrible. And of course, the leadership is already leaving. Saleh Muslim, the creator of Rojava and this whole fantasy of 2015, 2016, he's now happily sitting in Berlin. I saw him in February. He was in Prague, and then he went off to Germany. So he's okay, and I'm sure his wife and kids are fine. But it's the civilians who are going to get caught in this, and they're going to die. And it's sad.
Question.
Sorry.
Thank you for a great presentation. I wish Washington would listen to your expertise and others, but as you know. Two quick questions. First, could you mention the fact that all this mess is due first and foremost by the two Bush's administration, which destroyed Iraq, which was the state of Iraq, which was balancing more or less, for good or bad reason, the power structure between Iran and the Gulf states and the whole situation. And my second question, why have the Europeans been so weak compared to the situation in Libya? The Europeans have been mute, paralyzed, impotent. They barely spoke up, as a European Union. Could you expand on that, please?
Yes, certainly. You're quite right in that the catastrophe, the unraveling of the Middle East we see today is the product of two successive administrations. The Bush administration of 2000 and the Obama administration of 2008. The combined administrations unraveled the Middle East. The first one did so, as Michel quite rightly pointed out, by essentially removing a very hateful, very unpleasant dictator, Saddam Hussein, but then not factoring in or figuring out how we're going to ensure that this void that arises does not then create a catastrophe for us. So the lesson from that particular event was that action has consequences. So when the Obama administration came in, it came in with the, literally already armored with the idea that we must take no action. But what everyone else was telling them that, yes, action has consequences, but no action also has consequences. And so the action of the Bush administration created one catastrophe. And then the Obama administration came with its no action policy and essentially completed the disaster. The net result of this is we have now a very unstable region. The fantasy, I know this for a fact, the fantasy They would talk to us I used to talk to people on the NSC, we would talk to people in the administration, we talked to people in the DoD, and everybody was going around saying, this is containable, you don't have to worry. 2011, 2012, they kept saying, this is containable. And we were like, how is this possibly containable? How can you go around telling people this is containable? And I remember having an argument with one individual who was on the NSC and essentially left in 2012. And so we were at this scenario generator for Syria in February 2013, and he was going on about this. And I said, listen, this is a table. There are 14 experts around it. We all know what we're talking about. This is not a general public, so you can do your little sort of story that you sell people. You talk to us experts. Explain to us how this is containable. His answer was, and I repeat verbatim, he said, the Israelis and the Turks, they're big boys. They know how to look after themselves. Yeah, well, we saw how they looked after themselves. The Iraqis, it was Nur al-Malki at the time. Just keep giving him support. We saw what happened. In the end, essentially almost destroyed the country and he had to be removed. And the Lebanese, meaning Hezbollah, they've learned their lesson. I was like, are you serious? Is this the advice you're giving the President of the United States? That basically we're basing our containment policy on the fact that the Lebanese have learned the lesson and they won't get involved in a... And of course, 2 months later, Qasr happened, Hezbollah goes into Lebanon, from Lebanon to Syria, and the rest is history. I'm not telling you the name of the guy, but he's now a professor at Dartmouth. God help Dartmouth. See, this is why you have to come to Missoula, not go to... Because then you wouldn't have to hear. No.
Question, Janet, over there, if you could.
I didn't answer your Libya question, Michelle, I'm sorry, but I will come back and talk to you later. I know we can do this over.
Hello, I'm just curious, you mentioned sort of a possible void that could be left in Syria or sort of a worst case scenario. I'm just wondering, in your own opinion, what would be the most globally beneficial result from this Syria conflict? And would it be this East and West Syria with a demilitarized zone in the middle? Would it be the installation of some democratic system? Or in your own opinion, what do you think would be a good outcome, if there is any?
So if I got Santa Claus, the Easter Bunny, and, the problem is that what could have been done in 2011, 2012, 2013 is now almost impossible. And to tell you the honest truth, I really don't know what you can do now. The damage, not just to the country itself, but to the infrastructure, but to the people, to the fabric of that society has been so badly damaged. And I'm not telling you that you don't heal, you don't never come back from that, but it's going to take a long time. And I do know one thing, what we must not, I don't know if I can tell you what we must do, but I can more easily perhaps, or I feel more comfortable telling you what we must not do. And I think that the one thing we must not do is essentially allow for a continuation of the causes that led to the initial explosions. i.e., if we don't somehow build into whatever solution we're doing, if we don't build in some form of resolution to some of the core grievances that go far beyond just simple, human rights or, the freedom of speech or all these basic democratic sort of principles that we take for granted in our world here. No, but I'm talking about, we're talking about transitional justice. We're talking about some sort of restitution for all those people on both sides of the conflict, if you will, who got killed, who want some sort of justice or some sort of part of a reconciliation process, some sort of transitional justice format. If we don't address those issues as well, all we're going to do is hold this place, put more pressure, and it's going to blow up. When it blows up, it'll blow up worse, and more of this stuff will fly out even further and trigger more consequences down the line. That I'm sure of. I'm sorry, I couldn't do better than that.
I've got a quick question for you about Israel. If it's true Trump gets the U.S. forces out, how nervous is Israel going to be over this situation? I can't help but to think the pressures that they must be contemplating now in terms of the potentiality of the Americans, of our forces being gone, and all of a sudden Israel is sitting there holding the bag by themselves. How do you look at that? Thank you.
I hear you, and I think if I was the Israelis, I'd be deeply concerned, because for the Israelis, their strategic priority is obviously to keep the Iranians and Hezbollah away from this area here. And whilst everybody else is busy in all these other areas, then they have a chance. But if everything else gets, if we leave the area here, and then the regime takes it back, and eventually all that's left is this area, they're going to come for them. And if I have the Israelis, I'm going to have my hands full. And the Iranians want their pound of flesh. Sorry to use the Shakespearean. you know what I'm going there. Yeah.
Yes, at the Smithsonian last year, I learned about the Amnesty International exhibit where they had all the prisoners of conscience.
Yes.
And I learned about Tal al-Malawi, the 19-year-old blogger and poet from Homs, Syria, who was captured, and then she was committed to 5 years in prison. And I haven't been able to find out what happened to her. She's supposedly was going to be released in an exchange, a prisoner exchange in 2013, but since then has been incommunicado, and I would really like to find out about, do you know about her plight or what's happened to her?
I know who you're talking about, and if memory serves me, and I could be wrong, but I don't think she was released, and therefore she's probably most likely no longer with us. I'm sorry. I can go back and find out, but if my memory serves me right, I don't think she was released. She may have been released at a later one, but I don't remember hearing about it. This is something I'd have heard about. And of course, that's just for blogging, just for writing something against the regime. That's what you get. This is not it's not a picnic.
Thank you. Thank you for coming and presenting. What is your view on how social media has affected the conflict, and how, as more and less evidence has been shown through platforms such as Twitter, Facebook, and how that has affected the sort of global perspective of the conflict?
No, I mean, there's no doubt that social media and these types of communication platforms like WhatsApp and Viber have really changed how we view the world. The fact that I can now pick up the phone and call somebody almost anywhere in the world. I mean, the way I keep in contact with people in Syria, and it's just like I call you, or I can call Mehrdad, or I can call yourself. I can pick up the phone and right now call somebody in an opposition-held area and talk to them like I'm talking to you now. And that has really changed, I think, and has not just the nature of how sort of we communicate, but also the kind of accessibility. Just think about it. The fact that you could have an event occur, and as it is occurring, I could be transmitting it to millions of people. The gas attack happened, and within minutes, everybody around the world could see the horrible, horrible images. And they get loaded up onto YouTube, and then millions more people see it. And it really, changed it. And then, of course, this becomes not just a platform for information, but then it also becomes a platform for misinformation. And so there are people who have become experts at essentially developing, I don't know what you want to call them, counter-narrative, fake types of narratives. We're still debating how our last election was essentially influenced by social media and you know, these types of communication sort of abilities. So yes, it had a huge impact. It changed, I tell you, for nothing, it changed my sleep cycle. I used to be a normal person. I used to go to bed at, you know, I don't know, 10, 11 at night, and I would wake up in the morning like a normal person. And since 2011, my sleep pattern is now to reduce to about 3 hours, because I need to speak to people in Syria, and they're 6, 7 hours ahead of us, and I can speak to them. This is the thing. It's like, I want to speak to you, but I can't. I can't, so I go to sleep. But if I can speak to you for hours on end, and you can give me blow-by-blow accounts of what's going on, then I'm going to be up all night listening to you. And then I have to go to work, and I have to teach, and I have to do all the other things I do, and so I don't sleep anymore. My kids think I'm sick or something, but anyway.
Hi. Hello.
Hi.
Would you talk about the Kurds and whether they're part of the solution, maybe getting a homeland, or whether that would make things worse, or just speak about that a little bit, if you would, please.
I mean, the Kurdish issue is probably one of the region's biggest tragedies. I say it's a huge tragedy because there are other tragedies. The Palestinian issue, that's a major tragedy. But the total population of the Palestinians is 12 million worldwide. The world population of Kurds is something like, I think, 60 million. 60 million people, no home. That is a tragedy. Their home, the powers, the region, the colonial powers, just as they decided to deny the Palestinians a home, they also decided that the Kurds were not going to get one, and that their territories were going to get essentially left within the boundaries or borders of the emerging states, Iran, Iraq, Turkey, Syria, from the ashes of the First World War. And you could argue this was the right reason, this was the wrong reason, this was an unfair reason. Are the Kurds really one people? Are they many peoples? Are they more of a culture? And I think I would not like to sort of answer these questions simply because I'm not an expert, and it would be best left to a Kurd to talk about themselves in that sense. But I can tell you this. Almost 100 years after the Sykes-Picot, I think the 100-year centennial was 2 years ago, I think it would be unwise to suddenly wake up one morning and say, right, we're going to declare our independence. And we saw the effects of that. The Kurds in Iraq went from controlling a significant amount of real estate and resources to basically almost zero. They're now, they have to beg for anything. It was, I think, really sad. I remember in 2011, I worked very closely with the Kurds. I worked very closely with a Kurdish activist by the name of Mashal Tammu. He was a leader of the Kurds. And he and I had a sort of a common vision for the Kurds. And at the time I said to him, I said, Mashal, it is most important that the Kurds do not appear to be taking advantage of a situation, a catastrophe that is befalling Syria in order to essentially break free and declare an independent state. I think this will bring on it will not only alienate all the other Syrians, the people you need to support you, who believe in your cause, but you will also alienate and bring upon the wrath of neighbors like, at that time, Turkey and Iran, and possibly worse. And we're trying to contain this. This was 2011. Now, he was assassinated by the Assad regime in August 2012. About 3 weeks after, no, it was almost a month after we had met in Istanbul. And I told him, I said, what is most critical? Liberate your areas. Kick the regime out. And then publicly declare that you are holding these areas. I used the word amani. What is amani in English? In trust. Declare that you're holding these territories, these lands, in trust for the Syrian people to be discussed upon the end of the conflict. And he will earn the respect of every Syrian. And he believed in that, and he got killed for it. And then the more extreme nationalists came in and they decided to declare their Rojava. And now we see the result of that one. The Turks went in, they took Afrin. They're going to push until the Euphrates, and they will move the Kurds out of Membish. We will give Membish up, I know we will, whether the Kurds like it or not. The Americans will withdraw from there too. And then the Turks will have their way. And the Kurds, once we withdraw from the eastern side of the Euphrates, the Kurds will have nothing again. And all their efforts would have been for nothing, because before doing anything else, they alienated the very people who are supposed to be their neighbors. And that's never a good thing. That would be my response.
Question here, please.
Thank you very much for sharing with us. My question is, early on in your presentation, you talked a little bit about how both the U.S. and Russia and their leaders are in this to establish or more popularity or strengthen their positions. If we pull out, if the U.S. pulls out, how will the dynamic change with Russia, do you think?
Good question. I think that certainly from the Russian perspective, they will see this as we're doing them a favor. So if I were the Trump administration and I am trying to cut a deal, because, you know, we're the big deal makers here, so then I would basically go to the Russians and say, hey, I'll mosey out of Syria for you. What are you going to give me in return? Are you going to maybe stop poisoning whatever it is you're doing, or maybe you'll pull back, or maybe you'll pay for that new hotel? I don't know. I'm sorry. Wrong place, wrong time. You know what I'm saying? I mean, yes, they would look favorably upon that, I believe. Yes, sir.
If these areas of control were to be maintained, what do you see as the building blocks for trying to bring some sort of stability to this area? You talked a little bit about the Kurds.
No. I think you're asking a very good question, sir. Very important question. If the setup, right as we see it here, can be maintained, and the big if here is going to be, can we get the Iranians on the one hand and the Russians on the other to rein in the regime and stop it from essentially moving in against those areas, and or not sort of try to, or when they decide, okay, this is the final partition, and then those borders stabilize, then perhaps over time, you know, because business has to flow, you know, these areas, do not think of these borders as hard borders. Even now, even in the worst times of conflict, when much of this area was under ISIS, particularly in the east, goods and materials and people were moving back and forth, and people living in Raqqa were getting their salaries paid in Damascus, even though they were living under ISIS. I know it sounds bizarre, but these are not hard borders. So, but at least if you can create these stabilization sort of boundaries, perhaps that will give time for some new solutions to emerge. But it's very difficult to read the tea leaves right now. We have to wait and see what deals are going to emerge. And I think part of it is going to depend on what the U.S. wants to do, because nobody's going to show you their cards until they see what the U.S. is planning to do. So until our administration decides it's going to be America first or America great, we won't really be able to answer that question fully.
Yeah, so something that is kind of been present in this presentation is kind of a loss of faith in any vision for a Syrian future. And we see that not just in several ways. I mean, American forces special forces on the ground have stopped essentially training opposition forces because they don't really know what they're doing in Syria, just disobeying orders. From the administration, there are these missile strikes which aren't really oriented towards doing anything whatsoever. And I know several Syrians who have made that compromise, choosing the Assad side of the coin over the opposition forces because of Sunni insurgencies that cooperated with the opposition forces. And so what I'm curious about is how much of a push is there right now on the ground in Syria for an independent and democratic Syria? What is left of that revolution?
Sadly, very little. I mean, as I said towards the end of my talk, Syrians today have almost no control over what happens in their country. That is a fact. Okay, not even the regime does not have any real control, because if the regime today decided it wanted to, say, go and attack Raqqa, the Russians won't let them go. The Russians say, no, you can't go, and that's it. Or the Iranians might say, no, we want to go to the south over here, and then that's where they'll go. So, and similarly with the opposition, if the opposition decides, like Duma was under attack, all right? Duma was under attack. The only reason why the regime was able to attack the Ghouta enclaves over the last month and a half and bring it to a point of closure was because they were able to concentrate all their forces into that one spot. And the only reason why you're able to do that is because there are no fronts on the other side that are active. In a real war situation, where you are really in charge, the minute the regime concentrates its forces on one front, you light up the other fronts in order to force the regime to draw back, draw away its forces and disperse them again. But in the southern front, the Israelis and Americans would not allow the Syrian opposition there to open a front. They're totally reliant on them, so they're not going to do anything without that permission. And in the north, when they're not busy sort of eliminating each other, there are different factions. There's Nusra, Al-Qaeda affiliates, Ahrar al-Sham, FSA. There's a whole bunch, and they're all fighting each other. When they're not busy fighting each other, they have to toe the line and do what the Turks tell them to do. And on the Euphrates side, where the Kurds are and the Americans, in fact, they were supposed to be fighting ISIS, and they pulled their troops back up to Afrin to fight the Turks. So, I guess that sort of answers your question, doesn't it?
Amar, thank you very much. We greatly appreciate it.